This is the Writescast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing and the Wisconsin Writers Association, and always streaming at writescast.net. The winner of this episode's free critique of their manuscript's first 5 pages is Maria C. Congratulations to Maria. This is the second time you have won a critique of your manuscript's first 5 pages by being a patron over at patreon.com/writescast. Between you and Emily, you are leading the pack in terms of these monthly drawing winnings. So congratulations again to you, Maria. If you are a listener who would like to have your shot at having the first 5 pages of your manuscript critiqued by yours truly, you can head to patreon.com/writescast and enter in these monthly drawings. Again, that's patreon.com/writescast, where you can get in on these drawings and a number of other great patron perks. Oh, it's coffee. Yep, we're talking coffee again, specifically our friends at 421 Brewhouse Coffee. We love coffee, of course, because it fuels our ability to get to the page, or at least it does for me anyway, and I especially appreciate what they're doing over at 421 Brewhouse because they have such a sustainable approach to everything that they do, including the fact that when you receive coffee from 421 Brewhouse, you receive it in a reusable pouch. Yes, once you have gone through that coffee, which you will very quickly because it is delicious, you'll have a pouch available to you to reuse for, anything your heart desires. It's resealable, so you can keep things fresh in there. Boy, oh boy, it's almost like you could put more coffee in it, which you should probably do when you get more 421 Brewhouse coffee. So to get yourself your first bag of 421 Brewhouse coffee, you can head on over to their Shopify page and use discount code WRITESCAST at checkout to get yourself a little discount and to show your support for our programming as well. Again, visit the Shopify page for 421 Brewhouse and enter discount code WRITESCAST. Do yourself a favor, do me a favor, do everyone a favor, drink that coffee. This is episode 26 of Novel Approaches here on the Writescast Network. Welcome to the Writescast Network's Novel Approaches podcast, a craft-focused conversation for writers everywhere.
Because writing novels is hard, and we're all in this together.
Hey there, I'm author, writing coach, and weary querier R.R. Campbell.
And I'm Candice Lee, full-time author, part-time procrastinator, and guest co-host of the Novel Approaches podcast.
In this installment of Novel Approaches, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing and the Wisconsin Writers Association, we'll be examining emotional wounds as motivation. But first, Candice, thank you for joining me as a guest co-host. How are things going for you writing-wise? Yeah, of course.
Things are going really well. Weirdly enough, I just took this little Twitter poll saying, how are you doing in quarantine? And it said, you're doing surprisingly well. You're finally getting back to those projects you've been putting off for the last decade. And that's exactly what I've been doing. I'm jumping back into the urban fantasy I've been tinkering with for about 15 years.
Wow. All right. So how long was the gap since the last time you touched that?
About 5 years ago.
Oh, wow. Cool. So this is one that really you've been coming back to with like some nice space in between, probably gives you a fresh set of eyes when you get back to the pages, I presume.
Yes, I was worried it was all going to be garbage, and surprisingly, there's some stuff to work with. I actually have quite a bit of some good nuggets in there.
Well, that's reassuring. You know, it's one of those things you can look at and say, look how far I've come in the last 5 of these 15 years. And also, hey, there's still a lot to be excited about in it. So that's definitely a good thing.
Yep. So how have you been?
Oh, I've been hanging in there, took a break from querying for a couple of weeks, but actually as of this morning, got back at it. I know I said at the top of the episode that I am a bit of a weary querier, and that's not entirely true. I just liked the wordplay. I have had some success here and there with partial and a full request, so momentum is good. We'll see. Yeah, thank you. We will see what we get here in the coming weeks and months. But aside from querying, wrapping up a first draft of another manuscript, and this is the first manuscript in, say, years. I couldn't tell you when the last one was, probably going all the way back to maybe 2012. This is the first one that I am completely pantsing. And I have learned a lot along the way.
I absolutely cannot pants.
And I thought that I would be unable to as well because I have been such an outliner, especially for my empathy sci-fi series, because you have so many competing points of view. There are so many small details that need to be tracked and, monitored and made sure that we work them in there in a series, of course. But in a standalone where I was writing, actually, this manuscript is, despite being The Big Lebowski, but with a pet iguana and chintzy Christmas tree heirloom instead of a rug, this manuscript is fairly autobiographical. And so I think maybe that's why it's been a little easier for me to take a discovery approach to. So we'll see
You
how
already
it
know
ends
the
up, but it's going okay
story.
so far. Right, exactly. Writing from experience and, just fudging the details where I need to, because though this story is off the rails, my life hasn't gone quite as off the rails as the story goes. So I'll have to really do some separating of fact from fiction later, but that's for the revisions process.
Oh, revisions. That's the worst. I actually just finished rewriting the epilogue for my latest manuscript. I've been working on that book
Mm.
for 8 months and I finished it. I was so happy, proud, did my reread, realized, oh no, I need to go back and add like another 10 to 20,000 words of extra stuff in here. I hate revisions so much.
That's really interesting because for me, the revisions process is where I tend to take the most joy, I think, because I know that in a first draft, especially in this one that I've been writing not from an outline with, I know that there are threads that I have dropped along the way, but I've been keeping note of how I'm going to resolve them. And I'm going to be able to go into the revisions process saying, okay, so this manuscript finished at about 70,000 words. I've got about 10,000 more words that I know I need to add in to tidy up this thread, to shape this a little differently thematically. And that is when, after you finish that, second draft or maybe the third draft, then you can go, okay, hey, I've got a book here now. It's not just words on a page. This might be a book. And that, for me anyway, is always pretty satisfying.
See, I don't do that. I have to have a very well, tightly plotted first draft because if there's something major that went wrong, I cannot go back and fix it. I have to just trash it.
Oh boy, yeah, see, that would be severe, and that's why I think the difference in this case for me has been, well, in this manuscript, that again, it's the autobiographical one. I kind of know the story. I know what I'm embellishing and I know what I need to maybe shape a little differently. But yeah, if I had tried to do that with the empathy series, I would have been devastated and completely lost. So I guess it's just kind of about knowing yourself and what the manuscript you're writing needs, and you can kind of take it from there.
Knowing what your process is and how it works for you.
Knowing your process, knowing how it works for you, and knowing, of course, how these episodes work, because it is time, Candice, to hop into the conversation. We're talking this month about emotional wounds as motivation. And if you are a first time listener to this program, this is how it works. Every month, we throw up a poll on Twitter and we ask the writing community to choose between one of two topics to be discussed. This month, folks chose emotional wounds as motivation, and then we asked you in a series of prompts on Twitter and Instagram to let us know how you felt about emotional wounds in a few different dimensions. And over the course of this episode, we will share with you those prompts, we will share the community's replies, and then Candice and I will go back and forth discussing how we feel about that particular topic and how we feel about the input that has been provided by the community. So we have a bit of a warm-up here question, Candice. Why do we give emotional wounds to our characters in the first place? And if you'd like, why don't you take it away here with our first tweet?
Yeah, so James Damron, the handle The Punk Druid, which I think is amazing. That's a great name. They wrote, because physical wounds can heal, emotional wounds may never repair themselves. They provide an internal struggle that can be a weight on their soul.
And what do you think about that? I felt like that was a really, he says he's the punk druid, right? And it seemed like we had some elements of poetry guiding this interpretation of why we give emotional wounds to our characters. What did you think of that analysis, Candice?
I really like that because it's true. The one thing about emotional wounds is that it really takes you through the character arc. Most books don't really have much to do with, oh, I have a physical wound, I have to overcome this. It's always, what internal motivation do I have? Like, what is the internal struggle I'm dealing with? And that's usually where the story lies.
And that's really interesting, actually, that this angle has been introduced by James and that you have elaborated on it in this way, because one of the topics that could come up next month, actually, for novel approaches, we've got the poll up now. By the time you tune into this, listeners, the poll will have lapsed. But one of the things we're considering talking about is the intersection of inner conflict and theme. So without diving too deeply into that now, because we might have a whole hour on it next month, it seems like that might be what we're getting at here. We're talking about character arc, we're talking about growth, we're talking about attempting to overcome emotional wounds, and all of that can contribute to some extent to what it is we're leaving readers with in terms of theme. So really great stuff there, Candice, and really great from James as well. Of course, we had another response here, though, from Glenn Quigley. Folks, you might remember Glenn. He's been a guest on past episodes of the R.R. Campbell Writes Cast. Glenn tweets at, easily enough, Glenn Quigley. And Glenn says this about why we give emotional wounds to our characters. Depth, I suppose. A character without some kind of internal pain can feel a little flat. It's also a shortcut in terms of character development, a quick way of eliciting sympathy from the reader. So a little bit of multi-dimensionality here, Candice. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those kind of quick shortcuts of being able to make you identify with the character. If you know they have a certain type of emotional wound or trauma in the past, it's a very handy way to kind of get to the heart of the character and say, oh, so this is why they are the way they are. It's a bit of a shortcut, I suppose, but it really makes you really feel for the character, because everybody has these kinds of experiences in our pasts. What we call our past is the character's backstory. And if we can identify with that, it really makes us identify with the character.
And that relationship between our past, what we call our past, and the character's backstory, I think is really key, because if we were to present characters as existing only in the vacuum of the story's present, well, then that's like when we meet someone in real life and going into it with the expectation that this person has only existed in so long as I have known them. And we know that's not how that works, because people come to every conversation in their day-to-day life having had years of experiences behind them. And so when we start to see that sort of art imitating life, life imitating art, reciprocity, that really, I think, is what gives us that depth. And so, Glenn, great points there. Candice, grateful that you fleshed it out the way that you did. And we, of course, have to get in now to the real meat of this conversation, which is how, right? How can we use emotional wounds to our advantage as storytellers so that we can bring these characters to life in some of the ways that have just been suggested here? So we asked this, of course, of people in our hashtag RightsCast chat on Twitter. James, again, James is going to be a superstar in this episode, really guiding us through it here. This is the punk droid again. James says this about using emotional wounds to fuel characters' journeys. In my first novel, The Celtic Thistle, there were a lot of trust issues amongst the two main characters. It was so bad that even a rumor reopened the mental scars. It led them to finding ways to repair the bond and their love growing even stronger. So we saw that these wounds, in this case, it seems, Candice, they're being included to flesh out the characters and to show their background. It seems to demonstrate the conflict that exists between them, but then it also ties into, again, this growth at the end of the manuscript. Does that really resonate with you?
Yeah, mostly for all of my books, I always come up with my phrase is, what's their damage? So before you can even really get into the heart of the book, you have to know what has damaged the character. What is their emotional wound? What has traumatized them in the past? What are the scars? What are the scars that they've been living with? And most of my books usually have to do with learning to overcome those scars and fully heal. So, because a lot of the times I write a lot of romance, both characters have deep emotional wounds, and it really affects their ability to connect with other people or to connect with each other. And so you have something that happened in their past and it's affecting their present, and you need to have them overcome it to have a happy future.
Right. And that is something that I think is at the heart of so much great fiction. You can pick any TV show with which you particularly resonated, maybe setting aside something like a sitcom. You can pick out a book off the shelf. What is the emotional wound that the character has confronted? And I think about that specifically now in the context of my empathy sci-fi saga, namely the first book in that series, Imminent Dawn, where every one of the characters, our four perspective characters, has a deep emotional wound from their past that is guiding every action they take in that book. With Chandra, our art school dropout, well, she has enrolled in the first round of human trials for this internet access brain implant because she has lost her wife to this coma in an accident that she feels responsible for, and she desperately hopes that somehow they'll be able to be connected again through this internet access brain implant. You have Wyatt, the guy running the study, the scientist in charge of it all. Well, it turns out, yes, he's doing this for science, but he also has a very complicated relationship with his wife and love lost and loss in general, and how that fuels his approach to pursuing his scientific endeavors. And the list goes on with Ariel, always feeling like she was never quite good enough in a professional setting, feeling like she needs to impress, and those feelings of inadequacy kind of tripping her up along the way. And then Meredith, someone who is a talented journalist, all things considered, but just hasn't been in the right place. And the wounds that have come along with that motivate her to doggedly pursue the truth in the face of some really daunting circumstances. So we see it in the empathy series too. I'm tooting my own horn for a second here, if you'll forgive me, listeners, and Candice. But as you said all of that, Candice, it really made me think about how, wow, whether we even recognize it or not, we can stitch all of that into our own fiction as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Here we are, another episode brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing. Dandelion Web Marketing helps writers build a thriving author platform through strategic web marketing. If you're not sure if you're on the right track with your website, well, one of Dandelion Web Marketing's author website audits can help you find out. Right now, listeners to the Writescast Network can receive 50% off, and this audit will look at your content, security, design, search engine optimization, and more, and it will provide you with insight into what you might do to better connect with your audience. So, to learn the strengths and weaknesses of your current website and save 50%, you can visit dandelionwebmarketing.com/writescast to learn more. That's dandelionwebmarketing.com/writescast. And then we have here, of course, more input from James. Candice, if you want to take it away with this next comment from James.
Sure. So the nastiest storms one faces aren't formed on summer winds, but the tempests brewing inside the soul. Just remember, they will eventually blow over and a rainbow will form inside your heart. I love that. This really is poetry.
It is poetry, and James, I don't know if you were punk, so to speak, when you wrote that, but it did resonate, and it felt like a really great mirror, actually, for his previous comment to this, which was that, hey, it's all about how we come through on the other side to get to that rainbow that forms inside your heart. And it's got me, James, I'm going to tell you, you got me wanting to read the Celtic Thistle now. You've really got me fired up for it, so that might be one I have to add to my TBR pile, right?
Especially if the writing is just as good as these tweets.
And the amazing thing is I believe it was a few years ago, I had the opportunity to do some beta reading for pages of James. And it might have been for the Celtic Thistle, or he might have had the Celtic Thistle out at the time. And I do remember thinking about the relationship between the two characters on the page and being like, there is so much opportunity here. And I was reading a really early draft, so I have to imagine that what he has wound up with in the Celtic Thistle and other published work is, yeah, it's got to be in line with this. So great work there, James, and thank you so much for those contributions. And next, we want to consider the fact that there are, of course, generally speaking, there's more than one character in our manuscripts, right? And if we are working with an ensemble cast, maybe like in something, say, the Empathy Sci-Fi Saga, we have to find a way to balance the cast's emotional wounds. And Candice, actually, I make that statement now, and I say that we need to find a way to balance emotional wounds. Why don't we actually, before we get into the input here from people from our Writescast chat, why don't we explore why that is the case? Candice, do you have thoughts on why we need to balance an ensemble cast's emotional wounds?
I actually have a lot of thoughts on this because I write mostly romance, which means there are two main characters, the hero and the heroine, and they have parts in the stories that are equally important. And I feel like if one character has a lot more damage than the other, it can make the other character feel a little bit more flat, a little bit less interesting. You have the one super trauma, emo, damaged character, and he's just so full of angst. And then you have the heroine who's maybe like, I didn't have a really good high school life. Yeah. It makes it a little bit.
And that's
it's not quite balanced. And so you really need to be able to have the characters not per se be equally damaged, but they have to have the same emotional weight to their journey.
And on that point, too, for me, when I was setting up the empathy sci fi saga, one of the things that was also important was not only ensuring that both characters or that every character in the ensemble has a similar sort of depth to their wounds, but also that perhaps those wounds complement each other. So in the case of Chandra, well, she has this deep emotional wound that comes from an accident that befell her wife that she feels responsible for. And Wyatt, who is the antagonizing force for Chandra, actually has a very similar series of circumstances with his emotional wounds as they pertain to his relationship with his wife. And so what we see in the context there is this idea that, well, there should be opportunities for empathy between the two of these individuals, but because their motivations and because their approaches are so disparate, we actually see them become antagonists for each other when there are actually a lot of opportunities where, had they combined their powers and become Captain Planet, so to speak, well, they could have been in a much better situation. But if you've read Imminent Dawn, you know things don't exactly work out as the two of them would have liked. So keeping in mind that idea of having complementing emotional wounds can also be a boon as well, at least in my experience.
Also, one of the things I love to do, because I love to write standalone within a series. So each book has its own plot and its own couple, but then the sequels usually have to do with their friends or their coworkers or other people who have been side characters up until now, but now get their own book. Because isn't it true that when you watch a TV show, the most fun characters are always the side characters? You just want to know more about them, right?
Right. Think about my wife and I have gone back because it is the quarantine times. We've just been playing Seinfeld casually in the background. And I
Love it.
sometimes think about the character of Newman, right? Like Newman clearly has some things that happened to him in his life. I just kind of want to know what motivated him to become the person he becomes.
See, wouldn't it be great to have a spin-off of Newman? Did they do a spin-off of Newman?
Oh my God, you know what? They might have actually. I think that
That
there is a
sounds
chance.
familiar.
Oh boy, I'm looking it up right now. I never take breaks to do research during episodes, but oh,
No, go
they
ahead.
might.
This is a question we need answered.
Okay, so it says the New York Daily News asked Knight if he would be interested in a spin-off focusing on Newman, to which he replied, quote, I think Newman could show up on Law and Order as a snitch, but as for a weekly dose of Newman, well, I think if occasionally you're hit in the head with a with a hammer, you might get slightly dazed, but if you were getting hit week after week, you might get very upset. I'm paraphrasing there. So it sounds like
Small
there may
doses.
not, yes, small doses, right? There might not have actually been a spinoff. But anyway, it
But
seems we are not the first person to consider it. And to your point, Candice, yes, there is interest, of course.
yes, so the reason I love to write standalones within a series is because you write a book and you have all these fun side characters and you just kind of hint like what's their deal? What's their thing? What makes them tick? And you just get a little tiny hint of it. And then the best part is the next book is all about them. So you do get to have the spinoff. You do get to explore those little hints that I kind of put in there. So what I love to do when planning a series is plot out all the characters' damage and then put little tidbits here or there. I have this one super crazy twist reveal in book 4 of one series that I had planted the seeds of in book like 3 of the previous series. So I had to do book 4 of the last series and then book 1, 2, 3. And then finally I got to the reveal and people were like, oh, you planned it all along?
There
And
it
it's like,
is.
yes, when you have a really great character damage plot twist, you really want to like foreshadow that.
And I think it's really neat too because you're seeing again the synergy between your process and between a reader's experience of the pages. Because if you weren't an outliner, if you weren't as careful and deliberate as you are with your work, it probably would have been a lot harder, if not impossible, to set yourself up for that reveal because you would have had to kind of stumble your way into it. So there again, you see a really great connection between approach and page, which, hey, the show's called Novel Approaches, right? So we're tying it all together here. And that is what, the two of us have to say insofar as the why we want to balance an ensemble cast. But now let's talk about the how. How do we go about it? You and I got into that just a little bit here in our replies, but let's pull in some more feedback from the Writescast chat series over on Twitter. James had something to say again here, Candice, if you'd like to take it away with James.
Sure. So a relationship is like a garden. In order to grow, it requires hard work, a loving place, and tender care. If all goes well, it will blossom. However, a sudden downpour will ruin it. You just have to rebuild what's left and hope it will blossom again. See, I love that because that's kind of what you do in a book. You have the character's wound and you're trying to heal it and you think they're finally overcoming it. And then you have what I like to call the drop, which is the point of no return, which is the end. Everything is terrible. It's the drop point that makes you feel like nothing will ever be good again. And you feel the sudden downpour. And of course, that's just part of the storytelling. Eventually they come out the other side and everything is happy. But there is that one moment where you think they're never going to recover from this. This is too much damage. Their character arc will not support an overcoming of this. And I kind of love that point. I love that point in the book where you feel like there's nothing good that can ever happen ever again.
And that is something that I was introduced to conceptually as the proverbial dark night of the soul. And
Yes.
that is something that Sion, former longtime co-host of this program, introduced me to. We had a really great conversation about it on and off over the course of a few different episodes. So listeners, if you want to do a deep dive into the dark night of the soul, take a look at some of the episode descriptions and you will find surely some really great content on that. Because like you say, Candice, that moment is just the all is lost feeling. And then because we have some expectations in fiction that things will come around, particularly if you are writing in capital R romance, we know we're going to get our happily ever after. You know you have something to look forward to on the far end of that, and it's all about that rebuilding. As James says here, rebuilding what's left and hope it will blossom again. And that really encapsulates well, I think, a reader's experience of well-written fiction in that regard.
See, I feel like because I do write a lot of romance, readers expect the happily ever after, which just means I have to make that dark night the worst ever. I have to make it real painful, you know? Because it's not fun to get the happy ending if you haven't been completely destroyed beforehand, or at least that's what I think.
Yeah, and I will say that as I am discovery writing this, the Big Lebowski-esque draft of a manuscript, I encountered a moment earlier this week where I thought I knew what my final 5 chapters were going to be. I like to think a little ahead, insofar as I can anyway, at least in this process. And I started writing my way toward the end of a scene and I went, oh no, it's actually going to get worse for my main character.
Yes.
And I didn't want to do it because I was so genuinely worried, because it's not the main character that is going to be in trouble or in danger here, but rather their beloved pet. And that was horrible for me. But I knew in my head, spoiler alert, that things are going to have to work out. It was just like, can I really put both of them through this? And I'm doing it, and we're going to see how it goes. I think it's really what the main character also needed to have that final sort of turning of the knife kind of thing for them, to make them realize that their fatal flaw has classically been they're always blaming other people for their circumstances, but it turns out they need to start accepting responsibility for themselves and for their own growth. And it isn't until he loses temporarily his best friend in the world that he has to confront that in a very serious and significant way. And if I didn't choose to do that, if I didn't choose to really amp up the stakes there, I don't know if he would have had that epiphany. I don't know if it would have resonated thematically as strongly as I'm hoping it will. So, Candice, like you say, you just got to be willing to give them that little extra push. It might be hard, but give them that extra push, I guess.
If the question is, should I really do this mean thing to my character? The answer is always yes, definitely.
Yep, it's hard to do, but you got to see how characters respond to that tension and to that conflict, because it is through conflict and tension that our characters grow, and we can see them overcome some of their emotional wounds, or at least attempt to blossom once again, as James put it in his earlier reply. And we actually had another comment here, this one coming from Instagram. This is a new participant in the Writescast chat over there. This person posts on Instagram as DAMYANTIG, and they had this to say: the best way, and we're talking, of course, about the best way to balance an ensemble cast's emotional wounds, the best way is to create a unique character by seeing them in action. Free write scenes around them at critical junctures in their lives, even before they enter the world of the novel. That gives insight which can then be used to show emotional wounds that are unique to that character. And now this is me. Yeah, I love that too. And this is me saying this now. The quote has ended. But what I love about that is that by focusing on one character at a time and ensuring their uniqueness through, what we have seen here as a good described strategy, I think that's pretty fair. I like that idea. What do you think, Candice?
See, what I like to do, because I always write in first person POV, I always my books are always usually, you know, what is he thinking on the inside? And you get to kind of discover what he's thinking and what he's really about along with the reader. But I like to do a single point of view scene from the hero's point of view as a little bonus, and that is where I really get to explore their damage and what makes them tick, and like, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What has brought them to this point? And I feel like if because the those alternate point of view scenes don't make it into the book, they're just a little bonus for my readers. But if you can write those scenes that are not in the book, but maybe like a prequel or behind the scenes, something that happened in between two chapters. You didn't actually get to see it. Those are really enlightening because you've plotted out your book, you know what's going to happen. But when you just free write something and just see what comes out, that's kind of where the magic happens.
It really is. And that is, I think, again, a testament to knowing the right approach to the page at the right time for yourself and for your story. Because we're seeing here that even if you are someone who is an outliner, that there is inevitably something to that sort of inspiration writing when you kind of like let go and let your mind fill in the gaps. Because the thing about outlining is, at least in my experience, you can keep getting more granular and granular and granular about your outline, but at some point you're actually just writing the story. At some point your outline converges on story. And so when we fill in the little gaps in our outline, when we free write, when we fill in our characters' backgrounds, that's when we can wind up in these really great positions like you have, Candice, where we have these bonus POV chapters that can be read and digested by folks more freely. And along the way, you learn more about them, their view of the world, and perhaps about the other characters. So a really great strategy suggested here by our friend over on Instagram. And hey, we appreciate that input.
That actually reminds me. I have a prequel I've always wanted to write for one of my series. It's about how all the main characters met before the series began. And I've wanted to tell that story for a long time, but I always thought, oh, nobody probably really cares about that. I mean, it's not a romance story. It's a story of how the guys all became friends and got together. And I'm thinking now, I'm like, even if it doesn't fit into the book and even if nobody else cares, that would be a really great character study for me, just writing about who they were before the books and the series even began.
Yeah, and then in that way you get more familiar with someone you're already kind of familiar with. And again, I think all practice when it comes down to it, when you're doing that writing, even if it's something that other folks don't end up reading, if it's going to hit the proverbial cutting room floor, that's just more for us. We get a chance to get more familiar with ourselves, our characters, and I think any word written is not a wasted word. At least I would hope so anyway. Legend has it that this year's Wisconsin Writers Association's Jade Ring Contest is receiving a ton of entries. I wonder if part of it is because you, our listeners, are hearing these ads and you're hopping over to wiwrite.org and submitting your fiction, your nonfiction, and your poetry to the 72nd annual contest. Yes, it's been running for that long, and this year it is extra special because not only will winners in each category get themselves the coveted Jade Ring, they'll also be published in Wisconsin People and Ideas magazine and Creative Wisconsin Literary Journal. You'll also get the acclaim that comes along with being a contest winner and, of course, a cash prize. So, if you would like to learn more about the 72nd annual Jade Ring Writing Contest, you can head to wiwrite.org like I know so many of you have since we started talking about it here on the show. Head over there and submit your fiction, your nonfiction, and your poetry. Time's running out here, people. You only have until the end of May, early June to get these submissions in, so make it happen before that deadline arrives. Again, the site is wiwrite.org. So we, of course, have talked about being mindful of our characters. We've talked about being mindful of ourselves and our process. But it's important when we're talking about something like emotional wounds, at least I think it would be important anyway, that we be mindful of readers when we are writing our characters' emotional wounds. And so we asked the writing community in our WritesCast Chat series what it is they think about this idea and how it is that we can be mindful of our readers. And Glenn Quigley chimed in for this one. He had this to say: by treating serious issues with care, by not inflicting real world trauma on fictional characters just to fill up a word count. And so here we are, only about a minute after I said no word is a wasted word, but maybe we have a counterpoint to that here, where if you are just filling up a word count and trying to drive trauma and suffering home to no end, and not maybe being mindful of readers and their own trauma, I don't know. What kind of position are we putting ourselves in then? So what do you think about that, Candice?
I do kind of agree, because it's almost like that, those gratuitous Saw movies where it's just
Oh
gross
yeah,
after
God.
gross, just
Yep.
for the sake of being
Hate.
gross.
Yep.
Right. And some people love that. They love the gratuitousness of it. But for me, I feel like there's a certain point where like it's just too much. And even in writing, there are some novels that are so sad and so depressing and nothing good ever happens and it's so hopeless and just bad thing after bad thing. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. Maybe it's too much of a bad thing.
Right. And I think this is actually reminding me now of a conversation I had to have with a client recently about a manuscript that we've been working on only for a few weeks, a few installments back and forth here, where they were very much of the right mind and are of the right mind, even to something we mentioned a few minutes ago, Candice. And that's this idea that, well, if you can put your character through the gauntlet, if you have the opportunity to make them confront a deeper conflict, we should. But if our character is only ever experiencing tragedy, and if they seem to be experiencing tragedy time and time and time again as a device that becomes transparent to try and build up reader sympathy, but we're not seeing this character get any sort of victory along the way, well, we start writing what I could only classify as something like tragedy porn.
I knew you were going to say that word. I knew
There
it.
it
It
is.
was
Yep,
coming.
that's it. Yep, it's tragedy porn, or with something like Saw, it's like torture porn. And look, I'm not the audience for Saw. I'm not the audience for really anything that's remotely horrifying. That's not me. But even that aside, I just wonder about to what end, and we have to ask ourselves that question, kind of like Glenn points out here. We want to treat serious issues with care, and we don't want to just have trauma for the sake of trauma. We need it to tie into things like theme at the end of the day. We need it to tie into our character's growth, because then, here we are with that phrase again, we might just be writing tragedy porn, and I don't know what the market's like for that. Maybe there are some people who do that, but folks, for me, that's going to be something I'm going to be actively coaching you away from if you write it, and something I know I try to avoid in my own writing. So Candice, you seem to jump in on that word tragedy porn. What do you have to throw in on that?
See, I used to love reading angst. I just loved it. Anything that ripped my heart out and like pulled it out of my chest and then tore it apart and shoved it back in sideways. It was delicious. And as I grow older, I just do not have the constitution for that. I kind of like to joke that like, have grown faint and weak in my old age. I just feel like sometimes, as much as I love to torture my characters, sometimes I just want things to be happy and good. There's enough awfulness in the world that sometimes a little happy fluff and happily ever after is a good thing.
Right. And I think that I say probably, I 100% know that I am guilty of doing that in earlier drafts of some of the Empathy series books, including Imminent Dawn. I mean, there are certain things in that book where I look at now and go, I know what I have in mind for the rest of the series and how that comes around, but I might have wanted to paint it a little differently in book one. So there's just a little more hope for a couple of plot lines. And even in book three, which lies in a sort of half-written state, we're about, I don't know, got about 60% of a usable draft there. I know there are things, now that I haven't been working on it for months because I needed space between me and that manuscript, boy, oh boy, there are some things I'm going to pare back because I don't know what I was thinking at the time. But hey, you live, you learn, as you say. Maybe we grow weak in our old age, whatever the case might be. But I guess just like Glenn says, treat serious issues with care, be mindful, and keep readers in mind. Keep yourself in mind, and keep how you might grow and change over time in mind. But Glenn wasn't the only one who had something to say about this, of course. No, James. James chimed in on this one again too. Candice, would you like to take it away with James' tweet on this one?
Sure. This one can be a minefield. You never know how all readers will react. My advice is to research fully and rely on your editor and or betas. And I really agree with that.
Yeah, this comes into the idea of sensitivity readers. If you're going to be writing about experiences that aren't your own and are particularly traumatizing, and you plan on centering an entire manuscript around that, this is an opportunity to, one, if you can, work with sensitivity readers, and two, when it comes time for publication, content warnings, I think, are really fair game. They are something that I think it is always important to be mindful of. And I think that I'll say from experience, it's easy sometimes for folks to be dismissive of them and say, oh, well, it's a book, you got to strap in. But until you are someone who has maybe experienced a particular kind of trauma, I know personally for me, and we'll go content warning here on suicide and suicidality, it wasn't until after I experienced a really grievous loss in my own life that I found myself particularly wary of narratives that use that as a plot device. And though that is valid, and though it is something that I think it is important to be seen and portrayed in fiction, personally, that's not going to be where I want my headspace to be at. And so if I can know going into a book before I read 70% of it that we're not going to be relying on that as a trope, that's really helpful for me. And I always really appreciate writers who will share that in advance, because, hey, if you're willing to share it in advance, I might be willing to consider still reading that book, because it shows that you were mindful of it and you probably have a good portrayal of that experience. So that's just me, but I really do appreciate that idea of getting in there, using sensitivity readers, and relying on content warnings.
I had one book I'd had to do a lot of research for. The girl had a medical issue that had really impacted her childhood, totally impacted her life growing up, and was one of the kind of defining characteristics of her damage. And I didn't want to get it wrong. And I just so happened to have mentioned the plot point to a friend, and she said, "Oh, well, I know someone who has that exact disease." And I thought, oh, wow. I mean, do you think she would mind letting me pick her brain? And no, the woman was very, very helpful. She said, yeah, let me tell you all about it. And her life had not been the greatest. Dealing with this issue growing up as a child had really changed. Like, it was a very difficult childhood for her. But she got on the phone with me and we talked for hours, and I took notes after note. And yeah, she was very forthright and forthcoming. And I basically used everything she told me when I was writing that book to make sure I made it as real and as authentic as possible. I didn't want it to just be, oh, this girl has a disease that makes, her life hard. I wanted it to be very realistic. I wanted to have specific examples of what are some things she has been through and how does that affect her right now, and how does that damage, how does that emotional wound come through the plot, and how does she not so much overcome those wounds, because some wounds can't be overcome, but how do you heal and move on from those things? And yeah, it was a very enlightening conversation.
It certainly seems so, and it seems like it's coming down to, in this regard, then, it's about doing your research not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it is also going to ensure that you are then leaving readers with a book that feels significantly more realistic and true to life for individuals who might be readers who have experienced similar things and then are picking up your book. So it is very much in your best interest to make sure that we are doing that representation and doing it well, because if we don't treat serious issues with care, like Glenn says, well, then maybe we're just inflicting trauma for the sake of trauma. We're getting into the realms of tragedy porn, and then where are we? Maybe we're just doing it to fill up a word count. And folks, I know if you're a new beginning writer, you might be thinking, how am I ever going to write 80,000 words? I've only got 20,000 in me. 20,000 is okay for now. Come back when you've got words with purpose. It's going to be all right. You'll get there. You can make it happen. You don't need words for the sake of words, whether in the realm of trauma or anything else. At least that's my experience anyway. So we'll get now, of course, to our main takeaways, not just from this bit of the conversation, but the conversation as a whole. But before we get to our main takeaways, just want to issue a quick reminder that the Writescast Network is supported in part by listeners like you. Writers who support our programming financially at patreon.com/writescast get access to some really great patron perks, including Writescast Network swag, discounts on my editing services. There's a fun new raffle. I don't know how new it is at this point. We've probably been doing it for about 10 or 11 months. Fun new raffle for a first 5 pages critique every month. You get entered in one of those if you're a patron. You get some additional votes in the Writescast Awards, and you get early, ad-free access to every episode. So, hey, you can contribute $1, $2, or $3 per episode or per month. Everything counts. We really appreciate it. And it is through patron contributions that we are now moving to 4 episodes per month starting in June. So thank you, patrons. And if you would like to become a patron as well, you can head to patreon.com/writescast.
And we would especially like to thank Laura Hazen and Angeline Boley, whose contributions at the Wise Mentor level earn them shoutouts in every Writescast Network episode, on top of all the other great patron rewards they receive.
Yes, so one last time here for you folks. That's going to be patreon.com/writescast. But, all right, it's time now for main takeaways on emotional wounds from this episode. Candice, over the course of our conversation here, what is it that has really stood out to you as important insofar as emotional wounds are concerned?
I liked how, even though we didn't specifically say it in this way, the main takeaway for me is that the emotional wound has to have a point. You can't just give them a tragic backstory and do nothing with it. You can't just throw trauma after trauma at them just for the sake of having it be a plot point. If you want the character to be real and fully fleshed out, the trauma has to fit the plot, it has to fit the character arc, and it has to fit the overall theme and tone of the book. Because as we said, yes, we love to torture our characters, but that's because by torturing your characters, that's how you challenge them. That's how they grow as characters. That's how they complete that arc, that narrative arc. But if you're just throwing things at them just to make them miserable, just because you think that'll make your book good, well, that's actually not making your book good. It's just kind of, boggling it down with unnecessary gunk. Unless there's a point to the trauma, it's just unnecessary fluff.
Right, and I think that you're getting at what were also some of my main takeaways from this conversation as well. It's that in anything with storytelling, we want to make sure that we are judicious in the way that we employ it, and we want to be as, I haven't used this phrase in quite a while on a Novel Approaches episode actually, but we want to be economical with our storytelling, right? Is there a way that we can have every sentence do more than just introduce trauma, or do more than just describe the setting, or do more than just give insight into what a character is thinking? And the more heavy lifting that we can get every sentence to do, that we can get every plot device to do, that we can get every bit of emotional trauma to do, the more likely we are to leave readers with an experience that feels immersive, that feels memorable, and that is something that they can really walk away from feeling like they read an excellent piece of storytelling. At least that's my approach anyway. So a lot of really great feedback here from people like James, from Glenn, from our new friend over on Instagram. Really thankful for all of their insight, and for your insight too, of course, Candice, coming from your process. So why don't we right here go ahead and start wrapping up this episode by reminding folks that, as always, there will be opportunities for further engagement. Right now, you are voting, as of the time of this recording, in the next topic poll. You're voting over on Twitter and choosing between inner conflict and theme, the intersection between those two, or voice. So head on over to writescast.net when you tune into this episode, and you can find out what it is listeners chose for the discussion topic for our next Writescast chat and Novel Approaches episode. And then be sure that you hang out on Twitter on April 28th at 8 p.m. local time in Sydney, London, New York City, and Denver. We'll have a whole new series of prompts up there for you to respond to about whichever topic it is that you have chosen. And then from April 24th through April 28th, and oh my goodness, I'm saying April, but I mean May. Folks, I mean May. We'll be talking about these May 28th at 8 p.m. local time on Twitter, and May 24th through the 28th on Instagram. You can check out those prompts there and participate in our chat. And that's what I've got for you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Novel Approaches here on the Writescast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing and the Wisconsin Writers Association. If you liked what you heard, we'd love it if you could leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And for more writerly podcast content like this, visit writescast.net or follow us on Twitter at Writescast. I am also on Twitter as @Candice Lee, so come and say hello.
And I am over on Twitter, of course, as @IamRR Campbell. Thanks as well to everyone who participated in our RightsCast chat on Instagram and Twitter. Next up on the RightsCast Network, I'll be interviewing Nick Chiarkis about the 7 touchstones for writing a thriller or mystery. So stay tuned as always for that one, which will debut on May 15th.
That's it for this episode of Novel Approaches. Thank you for listening.
Until next time, you know what to do. Write on and write well. This is the RightsCast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing and the Wisconsin Writers Association, and always streaming at writescast.net.